Hold a florin from 1433 in your palm. Feel its weight, exactly 3.54 grams of solid gold, stamped with the Lily of Florence. The inscription reads, Florencia Fior, ENTA, Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance. It was minted in the Zecca on September 7, 1433, during the city's most prosperous decade. But this coin was nearly the last piece of gold Florence ever stamped. Not because the mines ran dry, not because of war or plague or invasion, but because 3 days after this florin left the mint, the Florentine Republic was exactly 72 hours away from total economic collapse. Behind the marble facades of the Palazzo Vecchio, the men running Europe's banking capital knew a terrifying secret. The city's liquidity was vanishing. The numbers were catastrophic. On September 10th, the Medici Bank held accounts worth 800,000 florins. By the 11th, the branches began closing. By the morning of the 12th, capital flight had drained the city's commercial bloodstream. That is not enough credit to operate a Renaissance superpower for a single market day. 40 merchant houses had already suspended operations, and the contagion was accelerating. The world's financial epicenter was one council session away from a death spiral that would have erased the Renaissance before Michelangelo ever touched marble. This florin survived. The Florentine Republic nearly didn't. And the reason it survived tells you everything you need to know about the hidden fragility hiding inside every economic system, including the one holding your retirement account right now. Here's what they don't teach you in economics class. Every financial weapon used to day capital flight, liquidity crises, credit freezes, systematic bank runs was invented in Florence in 1433, not theorized, not conceptualized, actually deployed as a weapon of war. And the man who invented it never raised an army, never fired a shot, never even needed to leave his exile in Venice. Cosimo de Medici proved something that every central bank, every hedge fund, and every sovereign wealth fund now understands perfectly. Control the capital and you control the country. Remove the capital and you can collapse a government faster than any invading force ever could. This isn't ancient history. This is the blueprint. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, the panic wasn't about buildings or employees. It was about liquidity vanishing overnight. When Greece faced its debt crisis, it wasn't tanks that brought the nation to its knees. It was capital withdrawal. When Silicon Valley Bank failed in 2023, depositors didn't lose their money to robbery. They lost it to a run that drained billions in hours. Florence invented all of it. The mechanics, the psychology, the weaponization of trust itself. Because in September 1433, the Florentine Republic made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believed political power trumped financial power. They believed they could exile the richest banker in Europe and simply replace him. They believed the city's economy could survive without Medici capital. They were wrong, and what happened next didn't just reshape Florence. It rewrote the rules of power itself. It proved that in the new world being born, the man who controlled the ledger controlled the state. The crisis lasted 11 months. The lesson has lasted 6 centuries, and your bank account is still living inside the system Cosimo built. Let's go back to 1397. Italy isn't a country yet. It's a patchwork of rival city-states, each one clawing for dominance. Milan has armies. Venice has ships. Rome has the Pope. And Florence? Florence has something far more dangerous. It has bankers. That year, Giovanni di Medici opened a small counting house in Florence. Nothing fancy, just a modest operation handling deposits and loans for local merchants. But Giovanni understood something most people missed. The Catholic Church had a problem that only bankers could solve. The church was drowning in cash. Tithes poured in from every corner of Europe. Donations from kings. Taxes from bishops. Payments from monasteries. But moving that money was a nightmare. Roads were dangerous. Ships got raided. Physical gold transported across continents meant hiring armies just to protect it. Giovanni offered a solution. He would handle the church's money. He would move it invisibly through ledger entries instead of wagons. He would collect payments in London and deliver them in Rome without a single coin crossing the Alps. No risk, no theft, just numbers transferred between branch offices. The Pope agreed. And just like that, the Medici Bank became the financial artery of Christianity itself. By 1420, Giovanni had branch offices in Rome, Venice, and Geneva. By 1429, he'd expanded into Bruges and London. The Medici weren't just bankers anymore. They were the infrastructure that held European commerce together. Here's how it worked. A wool merchant in London owed money to a silk trader in Florence. Instead of shipping gold across hostile territory, the merchant simply deposited funds at the Medici branch in London. The Medici recorded the transaction. Then their Florence branch paid out the equivalent amount in florins to the silk trader minus a small fee for the service. It was genius. The Medici never touched the gold, they just moved the numbers. And those numbers made them indispensable. But Giovanni's real innovation wasn't the mechanics. It was the leverage, because once you're holding everyone's money, you're not just a banker, you're a kingmaker. Florence's wool guild needed capital to buy raw materials from England. The Medici provided it. The silk merchants needed credit to expand their workshops. The Medici provided it. The city government needed loans to finish construction on the cathedral dome. The Medici provided it. Every guild, every merchant, every civic project, they all ran on Medici credit. And when Giovanni died in 1429, he passed something far more valuable than wealth to his son Cosimo. He passed control over Florence's entire economic bloodstream. Cosimo understood the inheritance immediately. His father had built the machine. Now Cosimo would turn it into a weapon. He expanded aggressively. More branches, more clients, more leverage. By 1433, the Medici Bank operated in 8 cities across Europe. They held accounts for the Pope, the King of France, and half the merchant houses in Italy. Their loan portfolio was staggering. Textile manufacturers owed them. Construction firms owed them. Even rival banking families owed them. But Cosimo's genius wasn't just expansion, it was integration. He made sure Medici capital touched every corner of Florentine life. The wool industry, financed by Medici loans. The silk trade, backed by Medici letters of credit. The construction boom transforming Florence into a Renaissance masterpiece, funded by Medici advances to architects and guilds. Brunelleschi was building his impossible dome over the cathedral. Who provided the working capital? The Medici. Artists like Donatello were sculpting bronze statues for the city's churches. Who commissioned them? The Medici. Even the public festivals and religious processions that defined civic pride ran on Medici sponsorship. This wasn't patronage, this was strategic dependency. Because here's the part that mattered. None of these projects could survive without continuous cash flow. Construction required steady payments to workers. Trade required revolving credit to buy inventory. Manufacturing required capital to purchase raw materials months before selling finished goods. Stop the credit, and everything stopped. Cosimo made sure everyone knew this. Not through threats, through generosity. He kept the loans flowing. He kept interest rates reasonable. He kept Florence prosperous. And in return, Florence gave him something no amount of gold could buy: political immunity. Or so he thought. Because by 1433, the Medici Bank wasn't just powerful. It was the single largest concentrator of capital in Western Europe. And that kind of power made enemies. The old aristocratic families watched Cosimo's rise with growing alarm. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Peruzzi. These were names that had ruled Florence for generations, and now they were watching a banker's grandson eclipse them all. They controlled the military, they held the magistracies, they commanded armies, but none of that mattered when Cosimo controlled the treasury. Because Florence's economy had become a Medici dependency, not through conquest, not through violence, through credit, through capital, through the invisible threads of loans and letters of credit that tied every merchant, every guild, and every civic project back to a single counting house on the Via Larga. The Medici Bank had become more powerful than any government institution, and that terrified the men who thought they ruled Florence. So they decided to do something about it. They would arrest Cosimo, try him for tyranny. and exile him from the city forever. It was the biggest miscalculation in financial history, because they were about to learn that you can't exile the man who owns the economy. You can only give him a reason to weaponize it. By 1430, Florence wasn't just wealthy. It was the wealthiest city-state in Europe, and if you walked through its streets, you could see the proof everywhere. The Duomo dominated the skyline. Brunelleschi's dome rose impossibly into the air, a feat of engineering that defied every architectural principle known to man. Workers swarmed the scaffolding daily. Stone masons carved marble. Bronze workers cast massive doors for the baptistry. The entire city hummed with construction. Down in the Piazza della Signoria, merchants conducted business beneath the arches of the loggia. Silk traders from Lucca, wool merchants from Prato, bankers from Siena. They exchanged letters of credit, negotiated contracts, and settled accounts in florins that carried more trust than any other currency in Europe. The workshops along the Arno were packed. Textile mills processed English wool into finished cloth that sold from London to Constantinople. Leather workers crafted goods for export. Goldsmiths hammered intricate jewelry for wealthy patrons across the continent. Painters mixed pigments in studios that would soon produce works that defined Western art for centuries. This was the Renaissance, and it ran on credit. But here's what most people didn't see. Florence's prosperity wasn't self-sustaining. It was a magnificent illusion built on a foundation that could collapse the moment someone pulled the support beams. Those support beams were Medici loans. The Wool Guild looked independent. It employed thousands of workers. It controlled the largest industry in the city. It generated enormous tax revenue for the government. But scratch the surface, and you'd find that every major wool merchant owed money to the Medici Bank. They borrowed to purchase raw materials from England. They borrowed to pay workers during slow seasons. They borrowed to expand their operations when demand surged. The Medici held their debt, and debt meant control. The same pattern repeated across every sector. The silk industry, Medici capital financed the looms, the dye works, and the export contracts. The construction boom, Medici loans paid the architects, the stonecutters, and the laborers. Even the city's cultural flowering depended on Medici money. Cosimo personally commissioned works from Fra Angelico, Donatello, and Michelozzo. He funded the rebuilding of San Marco Monastery. He sponsored public festivals that drew crowds from across Tuscany. These weren't acts of charity. They were strategic investments in civic loyalty. Because when you paid for the cathedral, the artwork, and the festivals, people remembered. They saw the Medici name everywhere. They associated prosperity with Medici generosity. And they conveniently forgot that all of it depended on a single family's continued willingness to lend. The Florentine government believed it was independent. It had its own constitution, its own councils, its own elected magistrates. The Signoria met in the Palazzo Vecchio and made laws without consulting any banker, or so they thought. But look at the city's finances, and the dependency became obvious. Florence's government ran on debt. It borrowed to pay for military campaigns against Milan. It borrowed to fund civic improvements. It borrowed to cover budget shortfalls when tax collection fell short. And who held those government bonds? The Medici and their network of allied banking families. This created a dangerous dynamic. The government believed it had sovereignty. But sovereignty requires financial independence, and Florence had none. The city's tax base depended on thriving commerce. Commerce depended on credit. Credit depended on the Medici. Remove the Medici, and the entire structure wobbled. But in 1433, almost no one understood this. The prosperity felt permanent. The streets were full. The workshops were busy. The banks were stable. Florence seemed unstoppable. The illusion was perfect. Cosimo encouraged it. He dressed modestly. He lived in a relatively simple palazzo. He attended church regularly. He spoke humbly in public forums. He never flaunted his wealth or demanded recognition. This was calculated. Because real power doesn't announce itself. Real power operates invisibly, embedded in the systems people depend on without realizing it. The wool merchants thought they controlled their own businesses. They didn't see that Medici credit set the terms of their expansion. The city councilors thought they governed independently. They didn't see that Medici loans determined which projects got funded and which got delayed. Even Cosimo's rivals missed the full picture. Families like the Albizzi saw the Medici as nouveau riche upstarts. Successful, yes. Wealthy, certainly. But not true aristocrats, not legitimate holders of power. The Albizzi traced their lineage back centuries. They'd commanded armies. They'd held the highest magistracies. They represented old Florence, the Florence of noble families and military glory. Cosimo represented something else: new money, banking profits, commercial wealth. To the Albizzi, this wasn't real power. Real power came from bloodlines and military command, not from ledgers and loan agreements. They were catastrophically wrong, because by 1433, the numbers told an undeniable story. The Medici Bank held accounts worth over 800,000 florins. That's roughly equivalent to 40% of Florence's entire annual economic output. The bank employed hundreds of people directly. It supported thousands more indirectly through loans and credit facilities. The Medici weren't just rich, they were systemically important. Remove them, and you didn't just lose one family's wealth, you lost the liquidity that kept the entire economy functioning. But the Albizzi didn't think in systemic terms. They thought in traditional terms. Power meant military force. Power meant holding office. Power meant commanding loyalty through noble prestige. They looked at Cosimo and saw a banker who'd gotten too comfortable, too influential, too close to controlling the city without actually holding a formal title, so they decided to act. They would use their control over the magistracies to arrest Cosimo. They would charge him with attempting to overthrow the Republic. They would exile him from Florence permanently. And once he was gone, they would restore the old order, the order where noble families ruled and bankers knew their place. It was a plan born from centuries of aristocratic tradition. It made perfect sense if you believed that political authority trumped economic leverage. But they were about to learn a lesson that would reshape European history. In the new world being born, the man who controlled the capital controlled everything. And you couldn't exile capital. You could only watch it leave. September 7, 1433. Cosimo de Medici received a summons to appear before the Signoria. The message was formal, polite even. The government simply wanted to discuss certain civic matters. Cosimo knew exactly what this meant. For months, Rinaldo degli Albizzi had been consolidating power. He'd placed his allies in key magistracies. He'd secured control over the Council of Ten, the body responsible for state security. He'd spent weeks building a legal case against the Medici family, framing their influence as a threat to Republican liberty. Cosimo could have fled. He had branch offices in Venice, Rome, and Geneva. He could have disappeared into his network and operated from exile before they even issued the arrest warrant. But he didn't run. He walked directly into the Palazzo Vecchio and surrendered himself to custody. Why? Because Cosimo understood something the Albizzi didn't. This wasn't a political crisis. It was a negotiation, and you can't negotiate if you're not in the room. They locked him in a cell in the tower. A small room, stone walls, one window overlooking the piazza. For 3 days, Cosimo waited while the Signoria debated his fate. The charges were vague: attempting to concentrate power, undermining Republican institutions, corrupting civic virtue through excessive wealth. The kind of accusations that sounded serious but lacked specifics. Because the truth was more complicated. Cosimo hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply become too successful, too influential, too impossible to ignore. The Albizzi wanted him dead. Rinaldo pushed for execution. He argued that exile wasn't enough. As long as Cosimo lived, he would remain a threat. The only permanent solution was to eliminate him entirely. But the other magistrates hesitated. Executing a man without concrete evidence of treason felt dangerous. Florence prided itself on being a republic of laws, not arbitrary violence. And besides, Cosimo had powerful friends, allies in Rome, connections in Venice, clients throughout Europe. Killing him might trigger consequences they couldn't control. So they compromised. On September 10th, the Signoria announced its verdict. Cosimo de Medici was guilty of conspiring against the state. The punishment was exile. 10 years. He would be banished to Padua, forbidden from entering Florentine territory, and stripped of all political rights. The Albizzi celebrated. They'd removed their rival without bloodshed, they'd restored aristocratic dominance, and they'd done it legally through proper republican procedures. They thought they'd won. But here's where the counterfactual becomes critical, because this was the moment. This was the single decision point where everything could have gone differently. What if the Signoria had offered Cosimo a compromise instead of exile? What if they'd said, you can stay in Florence, but you must reduce your political activity, limit your public influence, focus on banking, and let the traditional families handle governance? Cosimo would have accepted. Absolutely. Because Cosimo wasn't interested in holding office. He didn't want titles or magistracies. He wanted what he already had: economic dominance and the soft power that came with it. A negotiated settlement would have preserved Florence's stability. The Medici Bank would have continued operating. Credit would have flowed normally. The wool guilds would have kept producing. The construction projects would have continued. The economy would have hummed along exactly as before. The Albizzi would have saved face. They would have demonstrated that no family was above accountability. They would have reasserted aristocratic authority without triggering an economic crisis. Florence would have avoided the catastrophe about to unfold. But they didn't negotiate. They exiled him, and in doing so, they made 3 fatal miscalculations. First, they believed Cosimo's power was personal rather than structural. They thought removing the man would eliminate the problem. They didn't understand that his power came from controlling the infrastructure of credit itself. Second, they assumed another banking family could replace the Medici. Florence had other banks, the Strozzi, the Peruzzi. Surely they could fill the void and maintain liquidity. They were wrong. Because banking isn't just about having gold in a vault. It's about trust. It's about relationships built over decades. It's about knowing which merchants are creditworthy and which projects will generate returns. The Medici had spent 30 years building that knowledge. You couldn't replicate it in weeks. Third, and most critically, they forgot that Cosimo controlled capital that didn't belong to him. The Medici Bank held deposits from hundreds of clients across Europe. It managed accounts for the Pope, for French nobility, for merchants in London and Bruges. Those clients didn't care about Florentine politics. They cared about accessing their money. And the moment Cosimo went into exile, he took the access codes with him. The Albizzi didn't think about this. They were focused on political optics. They'd removed a dangerous rival and restored traditional authority. From their perspective, the hard part was over. They had no idea the crisis was just beginning. Because on September 11th, Cosimo left Florence for Padua. He traveled slowly. He made stops in Venice. He met with allies. He sent messages to his branch managers across Europe. And he gave a simple instruction: close the books. Not permanently, not dramatically. Just quietly begin recalling loans. Stop issuing new credit. Tighten liquidity requirements. Inform clients that due to political instability in Florence, the bank needed to consolidate its position. It sounded reasonable, prudent, even. Any banker facing political persecution would do the same. But the effect was devastating. Because the Florentine economy wasn't just connected to Medici credit, it was dependent on it. The difference is critical. Connected means you have relationships. You do business together. If one party withdraws, you find another partner. Dependent means you can't function without them. You structured your entire operation around their continued participation. If they withdraw, you collapse. Florence was dependent, and they were about to find out what that meant. The wool merchants were the first to feel it. They'd just placed orders for English wool worth thousands of florins. They'd expected Medici letters of credit to cover the purchases. Instead, they received notices that their credit lines were suspended pending review. The silk traders came next. They borrowed to expand their workshops. Now the Medici Bank wanted immediate repayment. Not next quarter, not next year. Now, the construction firms scrambled. They'd drawn advances against future payments to cover worker wages. Those advances were called in. Projects that had been running smoothly for months suddenly couldn't make payroll. And here's what made it unstoppable. Every merchant who couldn't pay their workers created another merchant who couldn't collect payment. The silk trader who laid off his workers stopped buying thread from the spinner. The spinner stopped buying raw silk from the importer. The importer stopped paying the shipper. The credit freeze cascaded through every layer of the economy. Within 2 weeks, Florence's commercial activity had slowed by half. Within a month, it had nearly stopped. The Albizzi watched in growing panic. They'd expected some disruption. They hadn't expected paralysis. And the worst part? Cosimo was doing nothing illegal. He wasn't burning warehouses or sabotaging shipments. He was simply managing his bank's risks during a period of political uncertainty. Any court in Europe would have ruled in his favor. A banker has the right to protect his depositors. A banker has the right to recall loans when the political situation becomes unstable. The Albizzi had created the instability. Cosimo was just responding to it. But the result was the same. Florence was collapsing, and the man responsible was sipping wine in Padua, watching his enemies destroy themselves. Because this was the genius of financial warfare. You didn't need armies. You didn't need violence. You just needed to withdraw the one thing modern economies couldn't survive without: liquidity. And Florence was about to learn what happens when liquidity dies. Week 1. September 11th through September 18th, 1433. The Medici branch offices in Florence began the process quietly. No dramatic announcements, no public proclamations, just administrative letters sent to account holders. Due to recent political developments, the Medici Bank is conducting a comprehensive review of its loan portfolio. All outstanding credit facilities are suspended pending evaluation. Clients with existing loans should prepare for accelerated repayment schedules. The language was professional, bureaucratic even. It sounded like standard banking procedure during uncertain times. But the merchants receiving these letters understood immediately. The Medici were pulling out. Panic spread through the wool guild first. These were the biggest borrowers. They operated on thin margins and high volume. They purchased raw wool from England on credit, process it in Florentine workshops, then sell the finished cloth across Europe. The entire cycle took months, and it only worked if credit remained available at every stage. Now that credit was gone, Tommaso Guidetti ran one of the largest wool operations in Florence. He employed 200 workers. He had contracts with buyers in France and Spain. He just received a shipment of English wool worth 15,000 florins, purchased entirely on Medici credit. On September 12th, he received notice. The Medici wanted repayment, full amount. Within 30 days, Tommaso didn't have 15,000 florins. No wool merchant kept that kind of cash on hand. The money was tied up in inventory, in work in progress, in receivables from buyers who wouldn't pay for months. He went to the Strozzi Bank. Could they provide bridge financing? Just enough to cover the Medici recall until his buyers paid up. The Strozzi hesitated. They had capital, but not Medici-level capital, and if they started covering Medici withdrawals, they'd burn through their reserves within weeks. They declined. Tommaso tried the Peruzzi. Same answer. Then the Bardi. Also no. By September 15th, Tommaso had laid off half his workforce. By the 18th, he'd shuttered his workshop entirely. 200 families lost their income overnight. And Tommaso wasn't alone. Across Florence, the same scene repeated. Merchants who'd operated successfully for decades suddenly couldn't access working capital. Loans that had been renewed routinely for years were called in with no warning. The velocity of money slowed to a crawl. Week 2. September 18th through September 25th, the construction sites went quiet. Brunelleschi's dome project, the pride of Florence, had crews working in shifts from dawn to dusk. They were so close to completion, just months away from finishing the impossible engineering marvel that would define the city's skyline for centuries. But the project required constant cash flow. Stone had to be purchased, workers had to be paid, equipment had to be maintained. The Opera del Duomo, the organization managing the construction, had borrowed heavily from the Medici to keep the project on schedule. Now those loans were being recalled. On September 20th, the foreman told the workers to go home. No wages this week. Maybe next week if the situation improved. 300 construction workers suddenly had no income. These were skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, bronze workers. They'd spent years on this project, Now they stood in the Piazza della Signoria, angry and confused, demanding answers from a government that had none. The same pattern hit the silk workshops, the leather goods manufacturers, the metalworking shops. Anywhere that ran on credit, which was everywhere, felt the squeeze. By September 25th, unemployment in Florence had tripled. Week 3, September 25th through October 2nd, the second-order effects kicked in. The merchants who lost their credit couldn't pay their suppliers. The suppliers couldn't pay their workers. The workers couldn't buy bread, meat, or cloth from other merchants. The baker on Via dei Calzaioli used to sell 200 loaves a day. By late September, he was selling 60. He had flour. He had ovens. But his customers had no money. He laid off his apprentices. They went home to families who were also struggling. The money that used to circulate through the neighborhood workers spending wages at shops. Shops paying suppliers, suppliers hiring more workers simply stopped moving. This is what economists would later call a liquidity trap. Money existed. The gold didn't disappear, but it wasn't changing hands. It was frozen, hoarded, locked away because nobody knew if they'd be able to get more. And when money stops moving, an economy stops functioning. The grain merchants noticed it first. They imported wheat from Sicily and sold it to bakers throughout the city. Normally, they extended 30-day credit terms. The baker would take the grain, bake the bread, sell it, then pay the merchant. But in early October, the grain merchants demanded cash up front. No credit. Too risky. The bakers couldn't pay cash. They'd always operated on credit, so they reduced their orders. They bought less grain. They baked less bread. The price of bread spiked, not because of shortage. Sicily had plenty of wheat, but because the credit mechanism that normally moved food efficiently from farms to tables had broken down. By October 1st, bread prices in Florence had increased by 40%. Week 4, October 2nd through October 9th. The Florentine government's treasury faced its own crisis. The city ran on tax revenue, but tax revenue depended on commercial activity, and commercial activity had collapsed. The customs duties from imported goods? Down 60%. Merchants weren't importing because they couldn't sell. The taxes on wool and soap production? Down 70%. The workshops were closed. The special assessments on bank profits? Down 80%. The banks were bleeding reserves. Meanwhile, the government's expenses hadn't changed. They still had to pay the city guard. They still had to maintain the aqueducts. They still owed interest on the bonds they'd issued to wealthy families. But the treasury was empty. On October 5th, the Signoria made a desperate decision. They issued new bonds, emergency borrowing to cover the shortfall. They offered generous interest rates, 8% annually. That was high for a supposedly stable government. Nobody bought them, because the wealthy families who usually purchased government bonds were the same families facing their own liquidity crisis. The Strozzi couldn't buy bonds. They were too busy trying to cover the Medici withdrawal from their own accounts. The Peruzzi couldn't buy bonds. They'd already overextended trying to help struggling merchants. And the Medici, the family that used to be the largest buyer of government debt, they were in Padua, unreachable, unconcerned. Florence's government was insolvent, not bankrupt. They still had assets, but insolvent. They couldn't meet their current obligations. Week 5, October 9th through October 16th. The rival banking families began to crack. The Strozzi Bank had tried to maintain normal operations. They'd extended credit where they could. They'd tried to fill the void left by Medici's withdrawal. But they didn't have Medici-level capital, and they didn't have Medici-level reach. Their European branches were smaller. Their client networks were narrower. They simply couldn't replace what Florence had lost. On October 12th, the Strozzi suspended new lending. They needed to preserve their own reserves. They'd seen what was happening. The contagion was spreading, and they refused to go down with the city. The Peruzzi followed 2 days later. Then the Bardi. By mid-October, Florence had effectively zero banking activity. No new loans, no letters of credit, no international transfers. The entire financial infrastructure had shut down, and here's what made it truly catastrophic. Florence wasn't just a city. It was the financial hub for all of Tuscany. Merchants from Pisa, Siena, Lucca, they all depended on Florentine banks for their credit needs. When Florence's banks closed, the crisis spread regionally. Pisan merchants couldn't finance their shipments. Sienese traders couldn't cover their grain purchases. The Tuscan economy was collapsing in concentric circles, all radiating from the same epicenter, the decision to exile Cosimo de Medici. By October 16th, 5 weeks after Cosimo's exile, Florence was in freefall. Unemployment had quadrupled. Bread prices had doubled. Tax revenue had collapsed. The government was insolvent. The banks were frozen, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. The Albizzi met in emergency session. They'd wanted to restore aristocratic authority. Instead, they destroyed the city's economy. And Cosimo? He was in Venice now, comfortable, patient, waiting, because he knew something the Albizzi were just beginning to understand. You can't govern a modern economy through military force or noble bloodlines. You can only govern it through capital. And capital goes where it's welcome. Florence was about to learn that lesson at street level. November 1433. Florence was starving. Not literally. The farms still produced grain. The mills still ground flour. The warehouses still held inventory. But the mechanism that moved food from producers to consumers had broken down so completely that people were going hungry in one of Europe's richest cities. Maria Caponi had worked in a silk workshop for 12 years. She dyed fabric, skilled labor. She'd earned enough to support her family comfortably. Her husband worked construction. Together, they'd built a decent life. Now neither of them had work. The silk workshop had closed in October. Her husband's construction site had shut down in September. Their savings had lasted 3 weeks. Now they were selling possessions just to buy bread at inflated prices. Maria wasn't alone. Walk through any neighborhood in Florence and you'd see the same story. Workshops shuttered. Markets empty. Families huddled in homes they'd soon lose because they couldn't pay rent. The wool district was a ghost town. The buildings that used to buzz with activity from sunrise to sunset stood silent. Looms sat unused. Dye vats went cold. The workers who'd filled these spaces had scattered desperately, seeking any employment they could find. Some left Florence entirely. They walked to Siena, to Pisa, to smaller towns where maybe the crisis hadn't hit as hard. But most had nowhere to go. Their entire lives were in Florence. Their families, their homes, their guilds. So they stayed. And they waited. And they got angrier. The bread riot started on November 8th. A crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria. Maybe 200 people at first. Workers, craftsmen, guild members who'd always considered themselves respectable citizens. They weren't revolutionaries. They weren't radicals. They just wanted to work. They wanted the economy to function again. They wanted their lives back. Someone threw a stone at the Palazzo Vecchio. Then another. The city guard moved in to disperse the crowd. Clubs swung. People scattered. But the next day, the crowd returned larger. By November 10th, there were 1,000 people in the square. They weren't just angry at the government. They were angry at the entire oligarchic class, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the noble families who'd driven Cosimo into exile and destroyed the economy in the process. The chants were simple: bring back Cosimo. We want work. We want bread. The Signoria watched from the palazzo windows. They'd deployed guards around the building, but you can't club your way out of a systemic economic crisis. Force might disperse a crowd, but it doesn't restore credit markets or restart closed workshops. Rinaldo degli Albizzi faced the reality he'd created. His political victory had turned into an economic catastrophe, and now the people were turning against him. The guildmasters came to him in mid-November. These were the men who ran Florence's industries: the Wool Guild, the Silk Guild, the Bankers Guild. They weren't radicals either. They were establishment figures, conservatives who'd supported the Albizzi faction. But they needed the economy to function. Their members were going bankrupt. Their workshops were closing. Their tax revenues were collapsing. They delivered an ultimatum: Bring Cosimo back, or we withdraw our support. Rinaldo tried to argue. We can find other sources of capital. We can negotiate with Venetian banks. We can. The guildmasters cut him off. We've tried. Nobody will lend to Florence. Not while Cosimo is in exile. Not while the political situation remains unstable. The Venetian banks won't touch us. The Genoese banks won't touch us. Even the papal bankers are hesitating. Because here's what had happened. Cosimo hadn't just withdrawn Medici capital from Florence. He quietly spread the word through his European network. Florence is unstable. Florence exiled its most successful banker for political reasons. Florence is not a safe place for capital right now. Other banks listened. Why would they lend to a city that had just demonstrated it would destroy its own financial infrastructure over political rivalries? What guarantee did they have that Florence wouldn't turn on them next? The reputational damage was immense. And reputation is everything in banking. Once trust is lost, capital flows elsewhere, and capital had flowed out of Florence like water through a broken dam. By late November, the city's treasury was in complete collapse. The government couldn't pay the city guard. They couldn't maintain the aqueducts. They couldn't cover interest payments on existing bonds. They tried minting more currency, debasing the coinage to stretch their gold reserves further, but that just triggered inflation. Prices spiked even higher. The florin, once the most trusted currency in Europe, was losing value daily. Merchants stopped accepting Florentine coins. They demanded payment in Venetian ducats or Genoese lire. Anything but florins. The currency that had symbolized Florence's economic dominance was now being rejected in its own markets. The psychological impact was devastating. Florence had defined itself as Europe's banking capital, the city where fortunes were made, the place where ambitious merchants came to build empires. Now it was a city where bread cost double and work was impossible to find. The self-image shattered. The pride crumbled. The confidence that had driven Florence's rise evaporated, and every day the question grew louder. Why did we exile Cosimo? Nobody could answer it satisfactorily. The official charges attempting to concentrate power, undermining Republican institutions, sounded hollow when the alternative was economic collapse and mass unemployment. The Albizzi had won the political battle. They'd used legal procedures. They'd followed Republican protocols. They'd removed their rival through legitimate means. But they lost the war, because in the New World economy emerging across Europe, political legitimacy meant nothing without economic functionality. You could have the most perfect Republican constitution ever written. You could have noble families ruling with ancient authority. You could have legal procedures that satisfied every philosophical principle of civic virtue. But if your people couldn't work, couldn't eat, and couldn't survive, none of it mattered. By December 1433, the petition movements began. Not riots, not violence, formal petitions circulating through the guilds and neighborhoods. Thousands of signatures, respectable citizens, guildmasters, even some aristocratic families who'd initially supported the exile, they all said the same thing: bring Cosimo home. The Signoria met in emergency session after emergency session. The debate was no longer about principles or republican virtue or aristocratic authority. It was about survival. Florence was dying, not metaphorically, actually dying. The economic engine that had powered the Renaissance was seizing up. The prosperity that had attracted talent from across Europe was evaporating, and everyone knew there was only one way to restart it. The man in Venice had to come home. The Albizzi fought it to the end. Rinaldo argued that bringing Cosimo back meant surrendering to financial extortion. It meant admitting that bankers were more powerful than governments. It meant destroying every principle they'd fought to defend. He was right. It did mean all of those things. But the alternative was watching Florence collapse into permanent irrelevance. On December 15, 1433, the Signoria held a final vote. The motion was simple: rescind Cosimo de Medici's exile. Invite him home. Restore his rights and properties. The vote passed. Not unanimously, but it passed. A messenger rode to Venice with the official decree. Florence was begging its exiled banker to return. Cosimo read the message. He smiled, and he began packing for his journey home. He'd proven his point. He'd won without raising an army. He'd conquered without firing a shot. He'd shown the world that in the modern age, capital was king. October 6, 1434, Cosimo de Medici rode through the gates of Florence to a crowd of thousands. They lined the streets. They cheered. They waved. Not because they loved him, but because they needed him. The exile had lasted exactly 11 months. But those 11 months had fundamentally transformed the relationship between capital and state in Western civilization. Before 1433, governments believed they controlled their economies. After 1434, they knew better. The Medici had proven that private capital could hold sovereign power hostage, that a single family's financial decisions could override political authority. That economic leverage trumped military force. Cosimo didn't gloat. He didn't demand apologies. He simply resumed operations. The Medici Bank reopened its Florence branches. Credit began flowing again. Loans were extended. Letters of credit were issued. The workshops reopened. The construction sites resumed. The economy slowly lurched back to life. But nothing was the same. The Albizzi were finished politically. Rinaldo fled into exile. The aristocratic families that had supported him lost their influence. And Cosimo? He became the uncrowned ruler of Florence for the next 30 years. He never held the title of duke or prince. He never wore a crown. He operated through proxies and allies. But everyone understood who actually ran the city. The man who controlled the capital controlled everything. This was the birth of a doctrine that would reshape global power for centuries. Call it the Medici Doctrine. The principle that financial control enables political dominance, that capital is the ultimate form of sovereignty. And you can trace a direct line from Cosimo's exile to every major financial crisis in modern history. Look at the 2008 collapse. Lehman Brothers failed on September 15th. Within days, global credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. Businesses couldn't access working capital. The unemployment rate exploded. Governments that thought they controlled their economies discovered they were hostage to private financial institutions. The solution? Bailouts. Trillions of dollars in public money transferred to private banks. Not because governments wanted to, but because they had no choice. The alternative was watching their economies collapse, exactly the way Florence collapsed in 1433. Too big to fail. That's what they called it. But it's the same principle Cosimo demonstrated. Make yourself indispensable to the economic system. Ensure that your failure means systemic catastrophe. Then, watch governments beg you to survive. Or look at the Greek debt crisis. In 2015, Greece elected a government that promised to reject austerity and renegotiate its loans. They held a referendum. The people voted no to the creditors' demands. Then the European Central Bank shut off liquidity. Greek banks couldn't access euro funding. ATMs ran dry. The economy seized up within days. The Greek government had sovereignty in theory, but in practice, they had no choice. They surrendered. They accepted the terms. They implemented the austerity they promised to reject. Because capital withdrawal is a weapon, and modern economies can't survive it, the Greeks learned what the Florentines learned. You can't govern without liquidity. The pattern repeats constantly. The IMF and World Bank impose structural adjustment programs on developing nations. The conditions are harsh. Cut public spending. Privatize industries. Open markets to foreign capital. Governments that resist find their access to international credit cut off. Their currencies collapse. Their economies implode. So they comply. Not because they agree, but because the alternative is catastrophe. This is Cosimo's legacy. The weaponization of capital. The transformation of banking from a service industry into a form of sovereign power. And it's not just governments that are vulnerable. Look at corporate America. Private equity firms buy companies using debt. They strip assets. They cut costs. They extract value. And if the company collapses, the firm walks away with profits while workers lose jobs and pensions vanish. How did they get away with it? Because they control capital. They control the financing that companies need to operate. They control the credit markets that determine which businesses survive and which don't. Or look at how central banks now operate. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan. They're supposed to be independent, apolitical, technical institutions managing monetary policy. But watch what happens when they threaten to raise interest rates or reduce liquidity. Stock markets crash, politicians panic, pressure builds, and the central banks reverse course. Because modern economies are addicted to cheap credit the same way Florence was addicted to Medici loans. Remove it, and everything stops. Cosimo understood this in 1433. Every central banker understands it today. Capital creates dependency. Dependency creates control. Control creates power. The structures look different now. We have sophisticated financial instruments, complex derivatives, algorithmic trading, global currency markets. But the underlying principle hasn't changed in 6 centuries. Whoever controls the flow of capital controls the system. Florence learned this lesson in 11 months of economic hell. We're still living inside the world that crisis created. Every time a government bails out a bank, every time a country surrenders to creditors, every time economic leverage overrides political sovereignty. That's Cosimo's ghost, still operating, still proving that money is more powerful than laws, more durable than governments, and more essential than armies. The florin from 1433 survived because Cosimo came home. Your economy survives because somebody like Cosimo lets it. The question you should be asking is simple. Who is your Cosimo? Who controls the capital your economy depends on? And what happens the day they decide to leave? Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme started in Florence 600 years ago. The day they exiled their banker and discovered he owned them all along.